So I want to preface that it's not the best presentation atmosphere especially for video, but with everything going on with the school boards, we're really not able to go in and do any type of presentation or additional learning at this time. So I'm going to start with this one, and then hopefully by the next assignment I can do something a little bit better. Okay, so I really apologize for not being able to see the screen very well, but we'll try to push through it. Okay, so I'm doing my workshop on learning disabilities. So the purpose of this presentation or this workshop would be to better understand what a learning disability is and how that would apply directly to our school board. Okay, so I would start off by introducing myself. My name is Stephanie Goulet. I'm currently working as an interest in Rainbow District School Board. I did my schooling here at Laurentian for my undergrad, my BA in Psych, and then I went off to Griffith University in Queensland, Australia, and I got a Master of Teaching at the primary level. Okay, so to start off, I would like to do an icebreaker to let all the members of the workshop get to know each other a little bit better. So depending on the group size, I would say break off into small groups or in partners, large groups, or even as a whole, depending. I would feel out the crowd a little bit. And I would ask everyone to choose one word that would best describe learning. I would give about 5 minutes, and then we would share that with each other. We would either write it on the board or put it up on the smart board or something like that. Okay, so here's the agenda of what we're going to do today. We're going to identify what is a learning disability, how is that affecting the child or the student, what is an individual education plan, and how is that going to help the child or the student. All right, I'd like to start off with this quote. The quote is, "Many children struggle in schools because the way they are being taught is incompatible with the way they learn." So I really like this quote, especially to start us off. It's going to help us better understand how important teaching methods are and how teaching directly relates to learning. Okay. So research has shown that no two children are alike. They don't learn in the same ways, and an enriched environment for one doesn't necessarily mean an enriched environment for the other. So in the classroom, children should be encouraged to and taught to think for themselves, and that the way they learn is okay, as opposed to trying to conform them all into one cookie cutter mold. Okay, and I think this graph really shows that nicely. 80% of students are successful within the regular classroom instruction, whereas 20% require additional specific instruction in order to be successful. So what I want us to take away from these slides is that learning is an individualized process, okay? Classes hold such a wide range of students, and it's not a cookie cutter approach, right? So let me try that slide again. So what I want us to take away from these two slides is that learning is an individualized process, and should be reflective of that. Okay, so disability doesn't exactly mean that you can't learn. It means that you learn differently, right? Especially based on this. Everyone's different, and so don't freak out about the term learning disability. Okay, so we can better see that if we look at the normal curve. So 50% of the population has abilities within the average range. So when I say standard scores, I mean results directly taken from an assessment. If they do a psychoeducational assessment, as we're going to talk about soon, we test a lot of different areas and we test the academics, and then it's all brought together within standard scores. So 50% of the population, which is not a very big percentage, in retrospect, has abilities within the average range. Okay, moving on the other end of the curve, 5% have a standard score of 75 or below. So if we're directly relating that to intellect, the way you think and reason and that sort of thing, if you have a standard score of 75 or below, you could be eligible to meet criteria for identification of mild intellectual disability, MID, or developmental disability, DD. MID is an educational identification, so that is really helpful in a school board process where you would be able to meet criteria to go into an ISP class, an intensive support class, where you would your needs would be met that way. DD as well. DD is also met in society. Some individuals who have an identification of DD can meet criteria to receive a pension later on. Okay. And on the other end of that, 2% of the population have a standard score of 130 or higher. And again, if we're looking at intellect, that could be the gifted range. Okay, so what does that mean for a learning disability? In order to meet the criteria for a learning disability, your intellect has to fall within the average to above average range. So the intellect has to be there. And then your areas of deficit, which we'll talk about in a second, would be in the lower range. Okay, as we mentioned before, if your intellect was in the lower range, you wouldn't necessarily have an identification of learning disability. That would be the MID or the DD. Okay, so now what does that mean in terms of areas of deficit? Okay, so areas of deficit could be the way you perceive information, your thinking and reasoning. Is that verbal? The way you use your language to answer questions, or is it nonverbal? So the way you can manipulate, for example, blocks or pictures, patterns, that type of thing, to develop answers to questions. Remembering, so your memory has, again, a variety of different parts. Working memory, so the way you can take information in, manipulate it, and give it back a response. So that could be, for example, 5 plus 5. If you ask a student what 5 plus 5 is, they have to remember what the number 5 is. They have to remember what plus means, what addition means, how to do that. They have to take that information in, perform the calculation, and give you a response. So mental math is big time working memory. So that could be another area that students might have a hard time with. It could be visual memory, remembering pictures, shapes, that type of thing. Verbal memory, remembering instructions being said to them, remembering components of a story if it's being written out loud, that type of thing. Another important aspect of remembering, especially with younger children, is making the information meaningful. For example, if you're going to tell a student a story about fishing and they've never done that, they have no interest in it, they're probably not going to be engaged in it. But if you use Frozen, for example, they might better be able to remember that information. It's more meaningful to them. They can relate to it. And therefore, they're more likely to remember that information. Okay. And so I listed some examples. So phonological processing, visual spatial processing, it's all some jargon, but processing speed is another one that's important to remember. How quickly a student is able to process information. So you might see that as in their work's not getting done in class, or they don't finish tests on time. They're able to do the work, but in a timed setting, it's really difficult for them. Okay, so those are all things that can contribute to the processing deficit, which is what's creating the learning disability. Okay, so these are the processing deficits. So again, if we remember, you need average to above average intellect, you need a processing deficit. And the third component is it has to directly affect your academics in order to get a learning disability. So academics, reading, writing, oral communication, math. Reading can be broken down into decoding. It can be broken down into comprehension. So maybe the student's able to read the information fine, but they're not comprehending. And that's the main component, the main point of reading. Okay, so it's really important to comprehend what you're reading. Writing can be spelling, it could be putting your thoughts onto paper, it could be the actual physical mechanics of writing, where they might have a fine motor difficulty, they might need occupational therapy, that sort of thing. Okay, or communication, expressive language, receptive language, so how they're able to express themselves, and how they're able to understand language coming in. Okay, math as well is interesting because there's two main components that we look at. So problem solving math, where they would have a graph or an image or a manipulative that they can use to solve the problem. Then there's also quick math facts, their math fluency, how quickly they're able to a page of math homework. Okay, so again, we have the average to above average intellect on that bell curve. We have the processing deficits, for example, the memory, the processing speed, the thinking and reasoning, and then we have it directly affecting an academic area. Okay, so I don't think we can see it. If I crouch over here, we can see the graph a little bit. This is a graph that would be presented to the school and to a family of students' ability. Okay, so I'm gonna just see if we can get a better view. I'll do my best here. On this end of the graph we have, I should start off actually, the blue bar in the middle of the graph is the average range. So it's where we would expect a student, their abilities to fall in most of the time. Okay, so I could probably point here. On this end of the graph, we have the intellect. We can see that their intellect is in that average range. And between the two bars here, we can see those are processes that affect learning. So that's where those strengths and weaknesses in this region would, if they affect the learning. So if they are strengths, they're going to positively impact their academic skills, and if there are weaknesses, they will negatively impact the academics. Okay, so we can see that this student both, and most of the time that's the case. Graphs are a lot of the time a roller coaster, if you will, which makes it really fun to see this type of thing. So in the average range here, hard to tell in the video, but the auditory working memory, the verbal memory that the student for this student, the dip here, I wonder if right here, that memory. So it's interesting, if this student was presented something visually, it got taken away and asked to remember, they would have a really difficult time doing it. Continuing on, we have some speed is in the average range, as is the phonological awareness, but the decoding, it's really hard in this region here. So that's the basic skills of reading, and that's where the student is having a hard time. That's where he's a little bit. Okay? This line here and all academics. So writing, language, or education, math. Okay? First, are all completely below the average range. If we're the basics of reading is a deficit, is a struggle for that student, it really makes sense to see that in reading all aspects of it, they're having a hard time. They're not able to decode the information. They're not able to comprehend what they're reading. Okay, so it doesn't come as much of a surprise. In this section here, we have some writing scores. Again, below average. And again, it makes sense. If the student's not able to decode, read, and phonetically sound out words, they're not going to have a good understanding of how to spell, of how to write, of how to put their thoughts onto paper, okay? That's going to be a struggle for them, and it makes sense because of their area of deficit. This student happens to have average language skills. They're able to express themselves. They're able to understand what's coming in, okay? And math as well. Math is a bit of a zigzag, but in most cases it is. And for all intents and purposes, their math is fine. Okay? So, looking at this graph, what I would note is I would say they have average to above average intellect, some areas of deficit, and it's directly impacting certain areas of their academics. In this case, this student is identified with a learning disability in reading and writing. Okay? So we're going to go on to what that means in a second. This would also be an area where I'd stop the presentation, ask if there's any questions. This is a bit complex, but it's something that's really important that the population of the workshop understands, because it's it would be part of the report that they would receive. It would be part of the parent meeting in order to do the identification of a learning disability. And it would also be what the school receives in order to have a better understanding of the student. This is a snapshot of their abilities, okay? Something I forgot to mention. When we present this information, we say generally the intellect component is what you bring to the table. It's what you're born with. It doesn't necessarily fluctuate, which is how we're able to do those identifications of gifted, of MID, of DD, or of average intellect. So your intellect is yours. Everything from this line and on are your academics, and those are things that can be brought up and down. As we're going to talk about in a minute, accommodations, modifications, that type of thing, we would put supports in place for the student in hopes to bring all their academics into the average range. Okay. So it's also important to note that there are many other factors that can contribute to students' learning. So maybe they have a lot of anxiety, maybe there's a lot of test anxiety, fears of going up in front of the classroom, of reading out loud. Maybe their social interactions are either hindering them or they're unsure of how to do it. They have a difficult time interacting or learning in a social situation. They might have some learning skills that they need to gain a better understanding. So studying, organizing, self-esteem, confidence in their own abilities, responsibility. Maybe their desk is a mess. They're always losing their work. They can't keep track. Those are also things that need to be addressed in order for the students, in order for these academics to come up. Other things can also be, what's their home life? Are they struggling? Is their parents going through a divorce? Do they have a difficult time? Did they suffer a loss? Did they eat enough? Or do they have adequate nutrition? Are they tired? Are they ill? Do they have any other medical conditions that might be affecting the way they're able to learn? Okay, so that's something to definitely keep in mind. Okay, so our student has been identified with a learning disability. Now what? So within the school, if they can receive an IEP, so an individual education plan. So the individual education plan is derived from that graph, from the report that the psychoeducational assessment has provided. So their profile, their strengths, their needs, as well as it's ever changing again. So as the student grows, as information becomes more complex, especially if they get an identification in grade 2, well, things are going to be a little bit different in grade 8 or in high school, right? So it must be closely monitored, constantly updated. Okay, so the IEP is developed for that student. It's an individualized process. So there's two types of IEPs. There's an exceptional IEP, so if the student has a learning disability or is identified with MID, DD, LD, learning disability, they would receive an exceptional IEP. So they've gone through all the legal processes in order to formally receive an identification and an IEP. Now, sometimes students haven't been seen yet. We technically don't see students with grade. That way, their age and the curriculum are able to. If the school is noticing that they need some support, they're not necessarily going to wait for the process of getting an IEP. They will provide them with a non-exceptional IEP, so they are not identified as an exceptional student. However, they are going to receive the services. Okay, so this would mean they don't have that graph to go off by, but teachers understand the way a student learns and are able to develop a program for that student without the formal identification. So also perhaps they went through the formal identification and they didn't meet the criteria. What often happens is we don't have that average to above average intellect. Sometimes it's sitting just below, and unfortunately what that means is the student is a slow learner, and for educational purposes they don't receive the learning disability criteria, and therefore they don't get a lot of the support. So they're achieving in what would be expected based on their intellect. Okay, So now that we know the two types of IEPs, we want to see, what does the IEP do? What does it mean when you get an IEP? So what an IEP does is it basically levels the playing field. It provides a student with accommodations, with supports, case-by-case basis, again, exactly for that student in order to allow them to succeed just as any other student would. So they have the same expectations in the curriculum. However, they have some supports, they have some accommodations. So there are a few different types of accommodations. There's instructional, environmental, and assessment. So an instructional accommodation is basically the way the student's being taught. So that could be, for example, teaching them in a small group setting, providing them with some assistive technology, reading to them any written components or written instructions, okay? Instead of making them rely on reading. So for example, if they have a learning disability, they shouldn't be expected to read instructions at the same level as their peers. They would be provided either with the technology, or the teacher would assist them, accommodate them in that way. Environmental accommodations could be, or within the classroom. So for example, some students have a really hyperactive, a really high level of distractibility, which is something I forgot to mention earlier. ADHD or ADD can definitely contribute to the student's learning. So if that's the case, they would need to have preferred seating. They would need to be sitting closer to the teacher. You know, the teacher's able to monitor that a little bit better. Maybe their vision isn't so good, they need to sit closer to the board. Those are some environmental accommodations. Some assessment accommodations, so is how they're able to access that assessment. Maybe it needs to be on the computer with the assistive technology in place. Maybe they need a scribe to write down their information instead of relying on them to write it, as with that student with a learning disability. Those are some assessment accommodations. Okay, again, I would pause, ask if there's any questions, and just went through a lot of information really quickly. Okay, so those are accommodations. Now sometimes accommodations aren't enough. So accommodations, again, are access to the same curriculum as everyone, with some supports put in place. There's also the opportunity to do some modifications. So you can modify it. The curriculum could be modified to a different grade level. So for example, the student is in grade 5. They're reading at a grade 2 level. Their reading would be modified to a grade 2 level in order to help them succeed, and hopefully that would change over time. You know, as it's constantly being monitored, the grade levels could move up. Okay, that could also be the same with a gifted student. Maybe they're being accommodated to a grade 7 level while they're in grade 5, right? Again, it's individualized, it's case by case. They really have to monitor and fluctuate the IEP. Now, sometimes the modifications aren't enough. They need alternative expectations. So this is not derived from the curriculum anymore. We would focus more on life skills, teaching them how to function at home, outside in the community, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and really preparing them for being outside of school. Okay, so alternative expectations, it's really important to note that you do not receive the same grading, you do not receive the same documentation for completing school. This is, however, aimed to promote student success, life skills, those types of things. This would typically be seen in the intensive support programs. Okay, so now that we've seen all that, we'd like to see what an IEP actually looks like. If these parents are being provided this at home, what are the important components of the IEP? Again, it's really hard to see if I crouch down. You can see the different aspects of the IEP. So with my mouse, of course you wouldn't be able to see that in the video. It starts off, so reasons. What are the reasons that the student was recommended to get an IEP? Okay. The identification, the student is identified with a learning disability. Okay, so there's the ID, Of course, the student information, what grade, what school year, that sort of thing. And down here are the accommodations. So this student, reading is accommodated, writing is accommodated. As we saw in the graph, they have a learning disability with needs in reading and writing. Those are both being accommodated. It's also important, it tells you what sort of assessments they've had. Some students have had the psycho-ed assessment from the school. Some students have had a speech language assessment. Some students have had an autism screener or things like that. That's all documented in the IEP because it's all pertinent information. Again, I would open up to questions, also in hopes that parents have their IEPs or the reports with them. I can go through it, help them answer some questions that they might have. Okay. To close the presentation, I'd ask everyone to get back into their groups, or even as a whole. Let's come up with another word that would best describe learning. And let's see how different it is in comparison to the beginning of the presentation. Do we have a better understanding? Are we more familiar? Are we more confident with what learning is? And I'm hoping to see things like individualized and that sort of thing. Okay, and at the end, again, I would open it up to some questions. This is where I would circulate and see how I can help each person as individually as part of the workshop, right? Practice what you preach. Okay, so again, I apologize for the shoddy visuals, and hopefully you were able to get a good idea of my workshop. Thanks.